What's going on, everyone? It is that time of the set release where we get to rank all of the new leaders now that FFG has dropped the full set for Legends of the Force before the set actually drops. A little bit of a preemptive leader tier list here, which you all know and love. I'm sure there's going to be some wrong predictions here, as there always is, and I'm sure there's going to be some right ones. So I'm going to give you all kind of my first impressions on all of the leaders shown. Guys, I have played a ton of Set 5. It has been so incredibly fun. Lots of really interesting leaders, lots of really different ways to play. And overall, the Force mechanic has been really interesting to play around. We even have leaders that have no aspect besides their villainy or heroism, which are really fun to actually play around with. So we're going to dive into it. There are some good ones. There are some bad ones. A big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon, guys. I am going to be doing a Patreon meet for the Galactic Championship. I will be posting that in my Patreon Discord. If you wanted to join the Patreon, it is down below for you all to check out. But for the tiers here, the S tier, and by the way, all of these tiers and the ranking of the leaders are within Set 5. So I'm not like saying this is going to be an S tier leader where it's going to be S top of the meta, but instead ranking the leaders comparatively within the set itself. That said, I do think the S tier leaders actually have a good shot of participating in the meta. Not necessarily like, top 5, but there is a chance that depending on how the meta shapes up, that these leaders could have an opportunity to break into that portion. A tier, these are leaders that I think are quite solid, and you might see around the tier 1.5, tier 2 range in the meta. B tier leaders, these are ones that have potential, and if the meta really shakes up to where they're super favored, then I could see them doing quite well. But overall, these are going to be like store showdowns, the ones that you can bring to your store showdown and do pretty well, but just not necessarily tournament exceptionals. C tier, these are the leaders that really didn't quite cut it, but have some sort of redeeming factor. Something really cool going on with what they're doing, or something that's like kind of fun and can win some games, but have some really big Achilles heel. And then D tier, these are the leaders that I just honestly could not really find a working combination. Yes, you can always win games with every leader in the entire game. However, the D tier leaders really feel like you should just be doing something else, or what you're trying to do to make the leader work is just making your deck worse. So those are the tiers. Let's start with the Vigilance leaders. And we get to start ourselves off with probably the most fun leader of the entire set for me, and that was Kylo Ren. And by the way, what you saw for the video was not really how I think you should be playing Kylo Ren, but it's just kind of a fun subsection. So Kylo Ren, for those of you that don't know, you use your action, discard a card from your hand. If you do discard an upgrade this way, you get to draw a card. He flips as a 7 to deploy 5/5 Sentinel. And when you do play him, you get to play any amount of upgrades from your discard pile while paying the costs. That includes aspect penalties. So the idea here is he's a Vigilance villainy leader, which is a really good aspect to start. Vigilance villainy is arguably one of the strongest combinations, so really good to start from that direction. You could also play ECL with Kylo Ren, which means you could play the new Darth Vader, which is one of, if not the most powerful cards in the entire game when you have ECL especially. So very powerful combination. Here's the problem. He deploys on 7 and he's a 5/5 Sentinel. So if you are using this guy and you're not doing anything with upgrades, he's pretty bad. So you need to kind of leverage that in some way. When you compare this guy to the, all the other options, even within the own set, like Talzin or even some of the other villainy leaders that usually want to match command with it, it is really kind of mediocre for Kylo Ren. You can do the cheesy strategy of running only Kylo Ren and doing all the upgrades, but he just completely falters to like a single confiscate, or like sometimes rivals fall or power the dark side. So it's really tough to pull that off. Instead, doing a little bit of a ramp strategy, kind of playing the traditional villainy vigilance command style is reasonable, but you're missing out on an earlier to deploy leader. Something like Talzin, for example, which we'll talk about in just a moment, deploys so much earlier, which is so much easier to actually control the board and actually leverage that for a win. As such, he's going to end up somewhere in low B tier or high C tier. And as of right now, I'm actually going to put him in high C tier. And the reason for that is, well, again, as I mentioned, he's super late in the game. 7 to deploy, especially when you're playing a controlling deck, is way too late in some matchups to even maintain parity with the board. And if you're trying to get more value out of your leader to deploy a late character, well, guess what? That's still not going to do much for you because he's still just a 5/5 Sentinel. Granted, you can buff him up with all these things, but he still dies unless you're playing like that Kylo Yellow with Shadowed Intentions. But even then, guys, that's still not all that powerful. Mother Talzin's up next. This one, 5 to deploy leader. We've got a Vigilance villainy. Action, use the Force, lose your Force token, give a unit -1/-1 for this phase. As I said, 5 to deploy as a 3/7, and on attack, you can give something -1/-1. This leader has been immensely impressive. And honestly, I am going to have to drop Mother Talzin yes tier. In terms of how she performs overall, right now, you could argue like high A tier. I'm going to put her like so far, and we might adjust this later, into like the low S tier category. The reason being is, again, as we talked about with Kylo Ren, Vigilance Villainy is a powerful combination. However, usually this style of deck is going to want to go a little bit later on in the game. The reason why I really knocked Kylo Ren's deploy cost is because you want to get later in the game, and having a 7 to deploy leader really harms you. Talzin deploying on 5 and having a really nice toughness alongside her really allows you to just dominate the game in those scenarios. Such as, you deploy Talzin, your opponent's got a pretty good ground force. Well, she could start knocking out units because she attacks for 4, essentially, because she gives -1/-1 to units. The other thing is, you could start picking off random units with -1/-1, or you could shrink down the unit so that she takes less damage, or you can kill a unit and shrink down another unit so your other unit could take out. Lots of versatility with it, and it's really, really powerful. The front side of her action is actually not that powerful. Yes, you can use the Force, and yes, you can give -1/-1. I've seen some Talzin decks where you're running like Karis and Talzin's Assassin with using the Force and trying to make all that work, which is totally fine. And that's definitely a powerful combination in some situations. But to be honest, the more success I've had has been just kind of running a standard Vigilance Villainy command control deck, and using Talzin as a way to get to the later stages of the game. And the nice thing is some of the unique cards from set 5 specifically work really well. Talzin, something like Drain Essence, is a 2-cost deal 2, but you get the Force, which essentially turns it into a 2-cost deal 3 with Talzin's action. So you can actually remove units on turn 1 with Talzin with things like that. So really a lot of versatility there. And more so than anything, it's just a really nice way to dominate the ground arena. And honestly, I've played her with 5 to deploy. You put Gideon down the same turn she comes down, and you can go to town. You can start putting experience on Talzin, and she becomes just a really annoying threat that it's tough to deal with. Next up, we've got Ahsoka Tano diving into the heroism. We've got Vigilance, Heroism, Ahsoka Tano. Action, use the Force. And then you give a friendly unit Sentinel for this phase. She's got a 6 to deploy leader. She ends up as a 5/6, and she says, on attack, you may give a friendly unit Sentinel for this phase. So first off, her frontside action, you've got to use the Force. And I didn't speak about this necessarily with Talzin, but when you're using the Force, you do need to have a deck that's built around generating the Force. So you have a couple options. You can use one of the common Force bases that generates the Force whenever you attack with a Force unit. Okay, not super difficult because we have a lot of Force units. For example, in Vigilance, Heroism, you have things like Yaddle, for example, which is a great turn 1 play that honestly most Vigilance Heroism decks want anyways, because it's going to help you survive. So that's not a big deal. You have Virgin's Temple in blue, which is nice to get some Force generated with, just high toughness units. Or you have, realistically, the command base, which allows you to generate the Force on command. Most often, you're going to be running the Force generating bases that are based on Force units attacking. Here's the problem with this is you not only have to play and modify your deck to have all those Force units, but then you also have to be able to attack with them to even get the Sentinel in the first place, which can be really kind of a nightmare scenario in a deck that's going to be a little bit more controlling with all these Sentinels. So that's its first downside. The second downside is that when you deploy her, yes, she's a 5/6, and yes, you can give Sentinel, but she deploys on 6 resources. So a 5/6, oftentimes with Sentinel, I'd rather have that a little bit more toughness than power. Even though the power is nice, I'd rather have a little bit more toughness based on when she's coming down in the curve. So between all those, between the fact that you want to play a controlling deck and you want to generate the Force and you want to be able to do that, but you have to take a hit on HP from your base, to me, she ends up somewhere in the C tier or potentially even D tier. And it's tough for me to say. I think as an initial one, I'm going to have to put her at the bottom of C tier, and she may end up in D tier if there's too many C tier cards here in a moment. But we got to talk about the next one, which is Cunning, guys. Cunning has been pretty interesting. We've got a Vigilance Heroism leader. Action, pay 1 resource, give a shield token to a creature or specter unit. He deploys for 6 as a 3/6 shielded. However, you also get +2/+2 if you control another creature or specter unit. Very, very interesting, to be honest. Something that I do think is really underrated. Not necessarily the flip side of just being a big unit and having shielded, but more so the front side of having this pay 1 to give a shield token whenever you want for the vast majority of your units. Because there are so many games where my opponent is just sitting there. He's got 2 resources. They play like an Attune Fearlock, or they play like a Sabine Wren if you're playing like Cunning Aggression, and then just put a shield token on it, and it messes up my entire game plan. Or they play a Lothwolf, for example, the new 2 resource 3/3 Sentinel, put a shield token, and it messes up your aggressive game plan. It is extremely obnoxious to just, whenever you want, have a shield token. On the other side, you could also preemptively put shield tokens on it if you have a unit that comes down and is a little bit cheaper than what you have in hand, or than what you have in terms of resources. And you might think, oh, is this shield token really going to be all that common? It's limited to creatures and specter units. Guys, there's a lot of specter units in the game, and a lot of them are very good. For example, in playing just Cunning Aggression, which is pretty typical, you have the new Ezra, which works amazingly on 3. You have the Sabine Wren. You have the Cunning, which comes on 4. Those are just 3 to consider. You also have the Ghosts. You have Sabine's Masterpiece. You have all manner of different units that you can put shield tokens on. If you're playing like double blue Cunning, which is another option with Doom, that works with all the creatures. Well, guess what? You still have Ezra. You still have all the creatures like Lothwolf. You still have Doom as a creature, right? And this doesn't have to be unique to just playing Doom. Like, you could play Lothwolf in the aggressive aggression Cunning. Personally, although I like double blue Cunning, and it's been pretty good, you saw me playing double blue Ray, I lean towards Cunning Aggression, mainly because you have the synergies with Force Throw. You still get to play Sabine Wren. You get a little bit more advantage with Sabine's Masterpiece. One of the best cards in the deck has been the Ghost, the big Ghost. You put Cunning down, he's got shield. You put a shield on your Ghost, because remember, the new Ghost costs 5 from, I believe it was Jump to Lightspeed. You put a shield token on it, it's a 5/6. It gives everything Sentinel. You put Cunning down, he's a 5/8 Sentinel with shielded. It's obnoxious. There's a lot of ways to perform. This guy, man, I think the tier list is gonna have to change a lot here. Honestly, I think Cunning is an S tier option. Ooh, it's tough for me to put. I think Cunning is pretty good. I mean, at least in terms of just what we've seen. This may just be changing though. If Vader's like a huge portion of the meta, which I think it will be, I could see Cunning dropping. Okay, if there's a lot of upgrade haste or anything like that, Cunning is gonna drop. So there's a lot of nuance to this one. Ooh, should I put it in A tier, guys? In terms of how it's performed just in the pre-release section against the meta there, in terms of how each of the leaders have done, honestly, I think Cunning is up here. But maybe it's like high A tier, low S tier. Because I did say Talzin's probably on the lower S tier side of things. And that's mainly because Cunning, although he does all those things, his aspects aren't quite as good as some other combinations. For example, Talzin Command, you get to play Vigilance, Villainy, Command. And that's a tough combination to beat. So even though I love Cunning, I do think he's performed exceptionally well. I'm going to have to put him just behind Talzin and maybe even the high A tier spot, depending on how many leaders we get up here. And that's the Vigilance leaders, guys. Very, very big difference. We got 2 in C tier, 2 in S tier. I do think this is pretty representative. Again, I think Ahsoka could be in D tier. I think Cunning could drop down to A tier. I think this is also respectable positioning, and we'll be doing changes as we go along. So let's dive into Command. So starting us off in Command, we've got Morgan Elspeth, which is actually a pretty interesting leader. Now, this one I think is really one of the hardest to rate, just because I have really not seen this do all that well. And this is one that I have played a little bit less than some of the others. mainly because I just don't see the real big appeal with Morgan Elspeth. So we have a command villainy leader. Action, choose a friendly unit that attack this phase, and you get to play a unit that shares a keyword with that unit, but it costs 1 less. You have a 5 to deploy leader, 3/6, and on attack, the next unit you play this phase with a keyword that shares with a friendly unit costs 1 less. So essentially, you play units with keywords, and then the cards with keywords that matches those keywords in your hand, guess what? They cost less by 1. So first off, resource cost reduction is pretty powerful, period. So immediately I'm like, okay, what can we do with Morgan Elspeth? Here's the problem with Morgan Elspeth is she's really kind of like a just okay deploy. Like 3/6, it's not like the worst thing in the world, but it's not great. She's not offering any additional combat stats on her other units. She's really just offering that resource cost reduction. The other thing with Morgan Elspeth is you need to set up, and a lot of decks are not going to let you set up. If they're knocking out your units, your leader does absolutely nothing. And you can't even get some combination of like, hey, I'm going to get this unit out immediately because you have to attack first. And then after your unit attacks, you have to get back to your action to use that again, right? Because you attack first, right? That's the key. And then you have to choose that friendly unit that attacks. So they not only have to survive the attack, they also have to survive past the attack after your opponent takes an action. That's something that really hinders it. And if I know anything about Jabba, this to me, I hate to say it. I actually think Morgan Elspeth is a D tier card. Oh man, if I'm gonna put Morgan Elspeth in D tier, I gotta put Ahsoka Tano in D tier, I think, guys. Yeah. I mean, it is what it is. Morgan Elspeth, really, really interesting. Even if that wasn't an issue, even with the stacking of actions and doing all this stuff wasn't an issue, and her deploy wasn't as weak as it is, you also have to match keywords, and there's not a whole lot of keyword matching up until you get to the later stages where you want like ambush. So you can play Vaders and Mauls and things like that sooner. To me, she's actually a D tier leader. It's just how I've seen it play out. There's too many actions, okay? Next up, we've got Snoke. And honestly, I think people are sleeping on this one. So initially, I was like, okay, Snoke looks pretty good. And every single time I played with this guy, he has just performed a little bit better than I was expecting. Command villainy, action, pay 1, exhaust. You give an experience token to a unit with the most power among friendly villainy units. Then he flips. He flips on 6 resources, but he is a 4/7 body, so totally average stat line. On attack, you give an experience token to the unit with the most power among friendly villainy units. So the first thing people were comparing it to was Tarkin, and honestly, that's the first comparison that I saw. Same aspects, same cost of action, almost same effect in that you give experience tokens to your units, right? This actually has significantly more versatility with it. And one of the key things, if you saw my video on Snoke, with Tarkin, there's a lot less options to put your experience tokens on that you're playing in your deck. Yes, Imperial units are pretty common, but guess what you can't do? Pike Sentinel on turn 1, take initiative, put an experience token on your Pike Sentinel. Now you got a 3/4 Sentinel in the ground arena, which is honestly obnoxious for a lot of decks to deal with. There's things like that that don't really happen with Tarkin. On top of that, it's not that you're always putting the experience token on the same unit. What generally happens is as you're playing along the curve, you're putting the experience token and you get to choose amongst your units. For example, let's say turn 1 you play Pike Sentinel, put an experience token on it, and then you follow up with some random space unit like an Inferno 4. The next turn you got 4 resources. Let's say, okay, well, I don't have a 4-drop, but I guess what? I've got a phase 3 Dark Trooper. Well, now you could put the experience token on the phase 3 Dark Trooper, or you could put it on the Pike Sentinel again. And depending on the options available to you, you can do exactly that. Or let's say when you get to later on in the game and you've got Darth Vader's out. Darth Vader only has 5 power. And so you can actually have a lot of versatility because oftentimes by that point, Snoke has an experience token on him. And that's the biggest thing of them all. If you're playing a standard Vigilance, Villainy, Control deck with Command and Snoke, you've got removal. So then when Snoke comes down, you're going to be attacking and then giving himself experience. So suddenly on attack, he's a 5/8. 5/8 for 6 is pretty powerful. The next turn, he's a 6/9. Next turn, he's a 7/10. And these are amazing, amazing stat lines. He also has a really good curve where when you deploy him, you have given experience token, flip Snoke, attack, I got Overwhelming Barrage. Or even Overwhelming Barrage before you attack. There's a lot of options. Snoke is definitely an A tier. Definitely an A tier for me. I think there's a little bit of things that hold him back, such as he does deploy a little bit later, and you do kind of need to avoid, for example, Tarkin Town is a really good deck against this, or a really, really good base against this. So if you do happen to try to set up some experience token advantages, that can kind of dominate you. But Tarkin Town hasn't been super common in the meta right now, so that's something to think about. But overall, my experience with Snoke has been A tier. Next up, we've got Avar, Chris, whatever it is. I know I've heard people say like Ivar. I think it's Avar, Chris, but correct me if I'm wrong. Anyways, Vigilance, or not Vigilance, Command, Heroism, Leader. Action, the Force is with you. So you have an action to exhaust your leader and just create the Force whenever you want. But, and this is a little bit interesting, she deploys for 9 resources minus the amount of times you've used the Force this phase. So, for example, if you use the Force twice, it costs 7. Here's the key factor that people don't really think about. You need to use the Force in that exact turn. It's not like you can use the Force throughout the game and it's just cheaper. She deploys as a 4/10, but if the Force is with you, you get +4/+0 and Overwhelm. So a fat 8/10 Overwhelmer is actually pretty powerful. So here's what's happened with this leader here. You play a deck, you're playing a lot of the Force generating bases / units. You play a lot of the units and events that consume the Force. You've got things like maybe the Will of the Force. You've got things like Luke Skywalker. You've got things like Eth Koth. You've got things like Jedi Consular. There's some powerful things you can do there. For example, Jedi Consular into the new Daughter, which is a 4-drop unit, or is it 4-drop or 5-drop? I believe it's actually 5-drop because you play it on turn 2. So 5-drop, she's a 4/6. She uses the Force whenever damage is dealt to the base. So you can really stack up a lot of Force usages there. Despite all that, when she comes down, it's late enough in the game to where your opponent just oftentimes removes it if they're in a control deck, or it's just too late to deploy. Even if you're in a dedicated deck that tries to use the Force as many times as possible, because in theory you can put her out early, in reality she can't do that because your Jedi Consular dies, your Luke Skywalker dies, your Eth Koth dies on the wrong turn. Whatever it is, there are so many different scenarios that doesn't really allow you to deploy Avar quickly into the game. It's usually on 7 or 8 resources when she comes down, and a 7 or 8 resources 8/10 Overwhelm is good. Okay, it is good if you've managed to survive until that point, but it's not enough to bring you back in a lot of games. And so for those reasons, I'm actually going to keep her in the B tier. She's not horrible by any means. She does have some really cool strategies going with her, but in reality, you just can't set up like you can with other decks. Honestly, the strongest thing that I think applies to her is the fact that you can generate the Force whenever you want, which means certain cards that you need the Force, like Eth Koth, or even like Yoda. The new Yoda actually works really well with her because you can curve Yoda directly into deploying her. Well, suddenly you've got a decent advantage there because you can have the Force whenever you want. I can definitely see like a low A tier placement, but I think there's just too many things going on to where like hyper aggressive decks, like I played against like the Sabines of the world, or even like the Quinlins, if they're attacking your hand, it's going to be really tough to deploy her early. And if they're just completely aggroing you out, it's tough to deal with that too. So to me, definitely like a B tier leader. Next up, we've got Obi-Wan, and this is the last of the command leaders here. This one's been really, really impressive. And I think this is another one that people are sleeping on. This one, Command Heroism, action, you use the Force, you give an experience token to a unit without an experience token on it. Seems pretty straightforward. It is incredibly powerful. Incredibly powerful. Arguably, out of every single leader on this list, this is one of the most powerful actions. It's comparable, to be honest, to me, Kanan's, Obi-Wan's, and there's one other here that I think has some of the most powerful actions in the entire set 5, and Obi-Wan's definitely one of them. On the flip side, he flips for 5, so it's a decently early deploy. He's a 3/6, okay? And on attack, you may give an experience token to another unit without an experience token on it. So basically, you have the action without, using the Force, just on attack. Not a great stat line, as I said, with Morgan Elspeth, kind of on the weaker side. But the important part is that he's generating so much extra combat power for all the other units that you have. It's really tough to deal with Obi-Wan. The best two variations of Obi-Wan that I've seen is Obi-Wan Yellow and Obi-Wan Blue. Obi-Wan Yellow, you've got things like Youngling Padawan, which come down, is a 2-drop, generates the Force token. It's a 3/4. It's a Force unit, which means when you attack with a new common base to generate the Force, you get the Force back, and you can use that Force to then go ahead and apply an experience token to the next thing that you play, which is exceptionally powerful. So now your 3/5s become 4/6s on turn 2. That's obnoxious to deal with. That is so much combat power over the course of a game that your opponent oftentimes just get outscaled and cannot fight back. The other deck, and honestly, my personal strongest version of Obi-Wan that I've experienced, is Obi-Wan Blue. Obi-Wan Blue usually uses the actual rare Vigilance base, the Virgin's Temple, and this is one of the few decks that is playing a Force strategy deck that isn't using the common bases. In my experience so far, the Force bases in the common section is what you want to be using. You don't want to be using the Mystic Monasteries or the Temple of Destruction or whatever that one's called, or the Virgin Temple all the time. However, because of Obi-Wan, it is exceptionally good. If you think about what that deck's going to do, turn 1, you play like the new Yaddle. You can play all manner of 4-drop units, honestly, on turn 1. Or you can just play a standard, Force unit, whatever it is. You get the experience token, great. Or you get the Force token, great. Next turn, you put an experience token on them. It's a 3/5. The next turn after that, you're playing Vigilance. So you can play things like Yoda, which is a Force unit. You get the experience token because you got a 4-drop. You can play the new Vigilance spacecraft that's 4 toughness. And a lot of, honestly, Vigilance spacecrafts or space units in 2-drop or in the 3-drop category have 4 toughness. So it's not limited to just ground units. You can play space units to generate the Force too. And because a lot of your Vigilance units are usually defensive in nature, you get Sentinels that are hard to deal with. You get Restorers that allow you to get more value throughout the game. And then you deploy Obi-Wan and you start passing out more experience tokens, and it becomes super obnoxious super quickly. Those are the decks. And honestly, I'm going to have to put Obi-Wan somewhere in S tier. There's a part of me that wants to put it behind Talzin just because of the aspect combination of Talzin. But if I were to rate, compare the leaders, I do think Obi-Wan as a leader has been more impressive than Talzin. And I think that makes up for what the aspect combination of Talzin is going to be doing. So I'm going to put Obi-Wan in the S tier. I do think Obi-Wan is one of the best leaders of the format. It has just been extremely impressive in terms of how well Obi-Wan can really just generate you a ton of value. And you've seen a couple games there where we start out and it's like, oh my gosh, they have like a 3/5 on turn 1. Like, how do I deal with that? Or turn 2, they got like, they had a 3/3 like Battlefield Marine. Now it's a 4/4. Like, what am I supposed to do? Like, when your units just get outclassed on every single portion of the curve, you just cannot recover. And then because you're constantly in that state of trying to recover, they drop a Jedi lightsaber on Obi-Wan, and now it's like a 6/9, and it's dominating your board. There's just so many things with this deck that I do think is quite well. That goes quite well. The only thing holding it back, and the reason why you might put it behind Talzin, is if you are up against like a hard control deck, which is not something that's super meta, it does suffer a lot. So for example, if you're up against Kira, honestly, Obi-Wan performs quite well because you could usually knock out Kira immediately because you got 4 power on one of your units. You can knock out their Sentinels. It's not that big of a deal. Yes, they have power of the dark side. Yes, they have removal, but usually your units are actually just doing well. And you can even build a deck with like Kelleran Beck and Luke Skywalker in the later stages of the game to generate that value. But if you're flying, it's like the Vader ECLs, and then you just get all your units knocked out. You got power of the dark sides, takedowns, and all the controlling cards. Obi-Wan ends up at number 2. But I'm going to do the hot take thing and put him in the number 1 slot, at least for now. Let's move on to the aggression leaders. On to the aggression leaders, and we get to start off with Darth Maul. So Darth Maul, aggression, villainy. He has this action to use the Force. You deal 1 damage to a unit and then 1 damage to a different unit. It's important to remember that if you only have 2 units on the board, one of them being yours, one of them being your opponent's, you have to hit your own unit. He deploys for 6 as a 5/6 with on attack the same action as you were doing on the front side, which is deal 1 damage to a unit and 1 damage to a different unit. This guy has been pretty underwhelming, to be honest, okay? He deploys on 6 as a 5/6, similar to Ahsoka Tano, but he's a little bit more aggressive. Like the whole point of him was trying to push in a little bit more damage, use a couple direct damage things alongside the 1 damage here, 1 damage there to really get a lot of value throughout the game. If your opponent has 2 units on the board, suddenly your action is a lot better because you do a 1 damage to one unit and 1 damage to another. But usually this is not enough to make a lot of the trades that you want or to actually knock out units. And this is the key factor, you have to build a force deck. So I talked about this earlier with, things like Obi-Wan, for example, or another one is like Mother Talzin. A lot of decks, if you're building a force deck, you have to sacrifice something. Either it's HP in the base, a base effect, or a combination of them both, or it's actually changing your curve to match what you're trying to do with the force. Changing the units you're playing early because you need to generate the force early. All those things are factors against Maul because the effect of using the force every turn isn't actually that powerful. In fact, what I've found is usually I'm just playing a force deck because I want to get value out of things like Darth Tyrannus as an example, right? So using the force is not a big payoff with Darth Maul. The actual body isn't that great, and really he's a quite simple leader. He's not horrible, but he's not great. Definitely a C tier. Maybe even D tier. I wouldn't fault anyone to really push him further down. The biggest thing with this is I think he's a little bit stronger than, for example, Ahsoka Tano. Because he's in better aspects. Really works well with force throw, obviously, because you can just kind of run force throw by nature of him being aggression. But also the villainy aspect combination really, really pushes you to being more aggressive, especially with all the new Inquisitors and things like that really actually benefit from having damage on them, such as like Fifth Brother. You can really get in a lot of damage, and you can just trade off because even though Fifth Brother has really low base power, you're going to be dealing 1 to your opponent's units. So Darth Maul does help with units like that, for example. There's some little bit of synergy with grit units and things like that if you do happen to be playing those. So yes, there's a little bit of a synergy going on there. But overall, he has not been exceptionally powerful past the C tier mark. Next up, we've got a fun one. This has been Third Sister. Third Sister, aggression, villainy. We have an action to play a unit from your hand. It gains hidden for this phase. So literally just exhaust your leader, use the action, I get hidden on a unit. This is actually not a bad action at all. I remember when I was playing Third Sister, the first couple, honestly, the first like 10 or 15 games between testing and between playing the actual games on camera, I would just forget that this ability existed. You could just use this every single turn because usually you're just curving out, unit on turn 1, unit on turn 2, unit on turn 3, unit on 4, whatever. And you just get hit on these units, which means your opponent cannot interact with those units when you play them, which is quite powerful. Now, there are a lot of different options for Third Sister. I tended to gravitate towards Cunning because I found her to be a little bit more aggressively statted. She does deploy on 5 as a 5/4 with hidden, and then gives the next unit you play on this phase on attack hidden if you do get an attack with her. So the idea is really poorly toughness, at least related stat line. You get a 5/4 body, which means super aggressive, but very, very low in the toughness department. However, the biggest thing in favor, and this is something that I talked about when she came out, is the fact that she has a hidden. Unlike that with like Kylo Ren or, IG-88, these cards with the 5/4 stat line, they die to like all the units in the world. This thing comes down and you can usually have her survive because the only thing that can actually finish her off is some sort of removal option. And honestly, if you're basing the downside of having a leader be killed by a removal option, then it's really not that heavy of a downside. The only exception with Third Sister is that, well, now those removal options can conclude like open fire and takedown. So there is a good chunk of removal that's better against Third Sister. But because of hidden, you're very likely to get an attack. You're actually very, very likely to go ahead and get Fallen Lightsaber on her or some sort of upgrade. And between that and all the other really, really nice Cunning units, you can actually perform a really nice aggressive deck. Not only that, but also a lot of the Cunning units coming down, they have low toughness or they have shields that you don't want them to break. And then because of the hidden aspect, you can really limit the amount of attacks that your opponent can get into them and then just stall out for more damage as you go along. So to me, she's actually just a B tier. I'm actually going to keep her exactly where she is. She's not incredibly powerful. She's not the worst at all by any means. She's been pretty good. Honestly. She's performed admirably. Very, very aggressive, and the hidden really helps her out specifically. And the next leader we've got is Kit Fisto, and this honestly might be the most controversial leader of the entire set. For Kanan, for Obi-Wan, yeah, some people think that they're a little bit worse, but at most people will put them down to like B tier or so, or you've got them up in S tier. They really don't fall into the C or D tier. Honestly, Kit Fisto, I've seen like, really, really across the board, people are like, dude, have you seen the combinations with the Kit Fisto? Dude, like Kit Fisto's a 1/6. I am definitely more into this category with Kit Fisto. For those of you that don't know, guys, Aggression, Heroism Leader, pay 1, exhaust. If you attack with a Jedi unit this phase, you deal 2 damage to a unit. Okay, not a bad action. Honestly, the action's my favorite part about him. Here's the thing I don't like about him. 5 resource, 1/6. That's right, he is a 1/6 to start. He does have Saboteur, and more importantly, he gets +1/+0 for each other friendly Jedi unit. Okay, so the idea is we go wide with Jedi units, right? That is the idea. And we're supposed to pump them up, and then because we flooded the board with Jedi, we're going to get an attacks, which means we can use the action to finish off units, and then we can also go ahead and have those units survive until Kit Fisto actually gets deployed, right? Well, here's the reality of a lot of these situations. There's actually not a ton of Jedi units. Like, there's a good amount, but oftentimes you're going to want to be playing other things along the curve, or you're playing things that are kind of outside the typical scenario for you to actually function with Jedi. So for example, if I'm playing Aggression, what options do I have for Jedi? Well, on turn 1, you have Adi Gallia, which is actually a good Jedi unit. Do like that one. You've got Jedi Starfighter, which is a 1/4 space unit on turn 1. This one's pretty bad, to be honest. I would not really be playing that. On the 3-drop slot, you got like Jedi Knight, which is the one that, if you have initiative, you deal 2 damage to enemy ground unit, but it's a 3/3. You got Ki-Adi Mundi, which draws you extra cards, but it's a 4/4. You've got a couple more expensive ones, but they're usually pretty late to the point where Kit Fisto would have already been down. You got things like Jedi in Hiding, Quinlan Voss, 3 and 4 drops, but again, Jedi in Hiding's like a weaker stat line unit and really is more value oriented. So what my point here is, in just Aggression, you're kind of like a couple of units are good and a couple of units are not where I want to be. And that's a big problem with Kit Fisto, because your whole identity of the card functions around having Jedi units. And if you go further back into, okay, what happens if you go back into previous sets? Well, there's even fewer Jedi, to the point where, like, in Aggression, you have Anakin's Interceptor, and then the next one is Anakin Skywalker himself in Aggression. Like, that's the level that you're talking about. So unless you're going into other aspects, specifically like Hu Yang is one that deploys a little bit earlier. You can go, Cunning for like Ahsoka Tano or Plo Koon, which honestly, I think you should be going Cunning because of Plo Koon alone. You're really going to find that at most, you'll have 2 other Jedi out when Kit Fisto deploys, which means he's a 3/6. So you better get some value out of that front side action, and you just don't really do that. So to me, this is a C tier. And honestly, if I'm being really honest, I would really put him down in D tier. But I have not found someone to really take advantage of his front side action. Every single time I've tried to play him, all my units get killed, and I'm really sad. But there are decks and functions to get a little bit more value out of Kit Fisto. I can't do it, guys. I can't. He's a D tier leader. It is what it is. I take it back. He's so someone flame me in the comments, please. Someone roast me and post your godly Kit Fisto deck and dominate me with it, please. Okay, I'm gonna put him in D tier. He's a 1/6. You're gonna have like 2 units at most. If you've got 3 or 4 Jedi on the board when this guy deploys, you're probably already winning the game. Okay, you just don't have 3 or 4 Jedi on the board. There's not enough Jedi, period, for the most part to do that. And even if you do have those Jedi, they're not going to be very good. And then even if you do have those Jedi, you probably could have just played better cards and been winning the game. And instead of playing Kit Fisto, you should have just played Sabine. Not that we're talking about the other leaders, but even in this set, you probably should have just played another leader. If you're playing Cunning, you could have played like Cal Kestis, for example. I don't know, guys. Kit Fisto. I was trying to be a little bit more fair and like understanding of where people are coming from when they putting him in like A tier, or even like S tier. I can't do it. I don't know. Maybe this is my one bias and I'll be incredibly wrong. I can't wait to come back to this tier list and be like, dang, I was so off about Kit Fisto. I have not seen anything that really pumps up Kit Fisto specifically. Okay? You can win games with Kit Fisto, but why would you win games with Kit Fisto is my next question. Okay. Now that rant is over, I had to do it, guys. It is what it is. I had to do it. Anyways, we've got Ray next up. Another aggression heroism and the final aggression leader of the pile. We've got an action. If you played a non-unit force card this phase, you deal 1 damage to a unit. Okay, kind of interesting. And then flips for 7 as a 6/8. When deployed, you may discard your hand. If you do, draw 2 cards. So first off, I actually want to talk about the unit side of this. Flipping as a 6/8 for 7 resources is honestly above curve. Like, it's actually a pretty good stat line. I'm not knocking that one too much. But her deploy trigger and everything else about her is like kind of weaker. Usually if you're playing these mid-range style of decks where you're trying to deploy a little bit later, get a little bit of value as you go along the curve, think about like Anakin Blue and Ray Red. Like these Anakin Blue and Ray Red. These decks kind of revolve around the same thing because Ray's usually going to want to be playing Vigilance. In order to get later on in the game, you're usually not going to be playing these other aspects like Cunning or Command potentially, but Vigilance is usually the way you want to go because you're deploying so late. You need a little bit more value-oriented, stalling out tactics, right? And by that point, you're probably not in a situation where you feel like you absolutely need this deploy trigger, which is discarding your hand and drawing 2 cards. Like, it's not like, oh my gosh, I absolutely need this in this moment. It's not horrible, but it's not great. And then the front side of like, okay, if you played a non-unit force card, which means a force event, you get to deal 1 damage to a unit. How common is this? There's not a whole ton of force non-unit cards that you're going to be playing along the curve. Like, yes, there are forced cards. There's no doubt about it that aren't units. But in terms of events, the most common one is by far force throw. Like by a large margin, it's going to be force throw. If you're playing Vigilance, you've got things like the Force is with me. You've got things like It Binds All Things. You've got things like Mystic Reflection. But remember, every single one of those, the Force is with me, Force throw, It Binds All Things, require you to play a force unit beforehand. Like a force unit. Otherwise, it's not going to really function. So then, if that's the case, we have to play force units, which means we can't take advantage of the action every single turn. And most likely, and the situations that I've seen with Ray, you're getting like 2 to 3 to 4 uses of her action by the time you get ready to deploy. Which is not horrible, right? Because by that time you got turn 1, which is at 2 resources, and then you have to go all the way up the curve, like 3, 4, 5. You got a little bit other turns that you have not been able to use the action, but you got a good amount, right? You could use things like Shatter Point, which is a new force card. You could use things like Cure Wounds. You could use things like Sorceress Blast if you're generating a force deck. But again, all of those new cards actually usually require you to be playing a force synergy deck, and that's another downside. So to me, this leader has been pretty bad too. I don't think she's very good at all. I'm gonna upgrade Morgan Elspeth to a C tier. I'm gonna upgrade her to a C tier because I'm gonna put Ray in D tier. D tier. Okay, she's just not been very good. It is what it is. 7 to deploy, 6/8, not bad. The action, pretty mediocre. I've just not gotten a lot of value out of her. I might be wrong. This one, I'm really curious to see if someone's really able to get a lot of value from this. The problem is that there's too many things you have to think about. I gotta play force units to get advantage of my non-force unit cards. But then if I'm gonna play some of these force cards, am I going to be able to really go ahead and take a lot of value from a lot of the other cards that I'm playing? The answer is most often no. And the 1 damage isn't even enough usually to really push you over the edge, right? Like, yes, you can get the 1 damage down, but is that actually going to help you trade? Is it going to help you get advantage on board? Usually, no. The 1 damage is not enough. You have to do multiple triggers of 1 damage for it to be enough. And that's where the tricky part comes in. So that's going to be aggression, guys. let's move on to Cunning. All right, we got the Cunning leaders next, and I think this is where most of the controversial, well, not just Cunning, but Cunning, Heroism, and Villainy, the last 6 leaders, I think this is where the most controversy comes. But starting last with Barris, guys, I mean, if I was being honest, it's just absolute Barris tiers. It needs to be a tier beneath D tier for all the Barris enjoyers out there. But we'll rank it based on the playability of the card. Why not? This one is a Cunning Villainy leader. We've got action, use the Force, play an event from your hand. It's going to cost 1 less. So first thing, you might be asking, wait, why might this be higher than Morgan Elspeth before I even rank her here? Well, Morgan Elspeth requires like a million things to go right. This thing just needs the Force token, and then boom, all your events are 1 resource cheaper, or at least the event you play that turn is 1 resource cheaper. She flips for 6 resources. She's a 4/7. She has the same action, but instead of having to exhaust, you don't even need to exhaust your leader in order to use the action, which is, play an event from your hand. It costs 1 less, but you have to use the Force for it. Okay. So we got that out of the way. She's a Cunning Villainy leader, which means you have a lot of events available to you. Waylays, no good to me dead. You've got the surprise strikes, the shoot firsts. You got breaking in. You've got a couple of the new ones, like Will of the Force if you want to. On top of that, if you combine other aspects in, like let's say you go in command, you got Overwhelming Barrage. If you're going Vigilance, you got Power of the Dark Side. And maybe even if you want to go controlling, like Super Laser Blast. If you're going to be playing Double Cunning, you've got Cunning as an event. So you got lots of different options as powerful events to be playing in Barris. So great. That's a nice way to really leverage it. So how are we getting value? Well, of course, we're getting 1 resource cost reduction, which is an amazing tempo advantage. That really buffs her up. And honestly, if you could rely on that, she might even be S tier. The problem comes in is, how do I generate the Force token? So typically, as I mentioned earlier, the best way is by the common bases. Play your Force units, attack with them, you get the Force, great, I use the Force. In Cunning Villainy, in the early game, you don't have actually a lot of Force units to play. And it's going to be difficult to generate the Force token. If you're playing Aggression, you have like the new Acolyte, you've got some of the ones like Shinhati, you've got Fifth Brother, right? There's some options there. If you're playing Double Cunning, you have very little ones. Like you got to play like the new Mysterious Hermit or the colorless one that generates the Force on attack because they're a Force unit. If you're playing Vigilance, you've got some other options. There's, depending on the aspect, you can do a little bit different. If you're playing Vigilance, you also have access to play like Dr. Pershing, and then you can play super cheap events. And this is something that I was doing, which is like Version's Temple, Dr. Pershing, play my Power of the Dark Sides and my takedowns and all this stuff a little bit cheaper, and actually play it as more of a controlling deck. That is something you can absolutely do, but that also means that you're trying to play a bunch of units to combo with Virgin's Temple. So realistically, the hard part about Barris is getting the Force token. The most consistent use is Mystic Monastery. You play that, you get 3 Force usages in a game, you get 3 cheaper events, which means you basically get, hey, I'm playing Mystic Monastery, I lose 5 HP, but I get 3 resource cost reductions in a game. I can play my Overwhelming Barrages for 4, I can play my No Good Deed Deads to 1, I can play my Surprise Strikes for 1, I can play my Waylays for 2, etc., etc., etc. For all those reasons, because it's a little bit inconsistent, but because the power level is high, I think she's somewhere around the A or B tier. It's interesting because her power level is very high. Like, the options that you have with her are quite good. The problem really comes in how consistent it is. So I think because of that, I'm going to give her A tier, because there is some really awesome things you can do. But I do think you can definitely like swap these two potentially, because she is a little bit inconsistent, and that's the biggest thing knocking her. We've got next up Grand Inquisitor. This one, definitely not as fun as the old Grand Inquisitor, huh? Cunning Villainy, action, use the Force, attack with a friendly unit. It gives the defender -2/-0 for this attack. And then we have a flip side, 5 resources, 3/5 shielded. On attack, the defender gets -2/-0. So first off, the action. You have to play a Force deck. What did I say about it with Barris? It's kind of tough to build a Force deck. Like, get enough Force units to be able to deploy early on. It's a lot easier actually in the Vigilance categories as far as I've found. or in the heroism side of things rather than the villainy side of things. You just have more options. You got things like Yoda, you got things like Grogu, you got things like Jedi Consular, you've got Gunji, you've got Yaddle. You've got a lot more options in heroism than you do villainy. So that's the first downside to Grand Inquisitor. So you're not even going to be able to use the action as much as you'd like. But then what does the action actually do? Well, you use the Force and suddenly you get a little bit of power reduction on your opposing unit. Is that enough to avoid the shield breaking? Because remember, they have to have 0 power for the shield to break. So if it's the same, like, okay, I reduced their power from 3 to 1, but my Grand Inquisitor shielded, or my Shin Hati shielded, or my Crafty Smuggler shielded, it doesn't matter because it still breaks the shield, right? Okay, so that's something to consider. But then, is it actually going to allow your unit to survive? And even further, would your unit have already survived had they not had that power cost reduction? And even further than that, is it worth attacking that unit? Because can your unit even kill their unit? And if they don't, is their unit just going to be able to attack your unit and still kill it? There's a lot of things that go wrong with Grand Inquisitor's ability. The best thing I think about him is that he's a 3/5, 5 to deploy shielded unit that has the Force tag, right? And the Inquisitor tag, which means you can do a little bit more things with him. He's going to be harder to take out, but he does die to takedown. But at least he doesn't die to open fire and a lot of attacks that otherwise would take out some other units. But he's a little bit weak in the power department. So for all those reasons, I think I'm going to have to drop him definitely down to the C tier. And honestly, I think he could live down in the D tier with some of these ones. I don't think he's very powerful at all, is the only problem here. I think you could make an argument for, like, okay, he's a little bit better than these ones because he's early to deploy. He gets down with a reasonable amount of power, and then he's just a Force unit that's going to survive, right? And you can get a little bit of value out of his action. But again, I just haven't really seen the value because the amount you have to manipulate your deck to guarantee the Force enough to actually use this isn't worth the payoff, right? It is just not worth the payoff. And if you just have a leader that's a 3/5 shielder that gives -2/-0 for the defenders on attack, that's not good enough either, because that's not enough to even remove their potential to break your shield. So for me, I'm actually going to have to put him in D tier. But next up, we've got Cal Kestis. We've got Heroism Cunning. This one's a 4 to deploy leader. And actually, is it the only 4 to deploy leader we have here? Yeah, it is the only 4 to deploy leader in the entire set. So a little bit unique there. We have a action, use the Force, and opponent chooses a ready unit they control, and you exhaust that unit. Okay, a little bit interesting. Then we have 4 to deploy, 3/4. 3/4. No poncho, no mustache. Big downside, okay? And on attack, an opponent chooses a ready unit they control, you exhaust that unit. Okay, so what have I seen with Cal Kestis? He comes down, he's a 3/4, and he does nothing. That's what I've seen. He deploys early, which is nice, which means you can pump in a little bit of extra damage. If you're looking for a hyper aggro deck, he comes down on 4 and he deals a little bit of extra damage. Definitely could be used there, right? I should say he's useless, but overall, his on attack trigger really doesn't do a whole lot. And because you're deploying Cal Kestis early on, you're probably not going to have the initiative on the following turn, which means he's just going to die because he's a 3/4, right? 3/4s are really, really susceptible to basically everything. Well, what about the front side of his, actions? Again, you have to play a Force deck in order to utilize it, which means if you don't manipulate your deck to function with this, again, heroism is a little bit easier. You got like Youngling Padawan, you've got things like Ahsoka Tano Vernestra, you've got other options. You are probably not going to be able to really get a whole lot of value out of this frontside action, because the frontside action isn't all that bad, right? An opponent chooses a ready unit they control, you exhaust that unit. Let's say you're playing the new Cunning base, and you're playing double Cunning Cal Kestis. Well, you have to use the action to generate the Force. Let's say you're playing the new combo bases that generate the Force when a Force unit attacks. Well, guess what? You have to attack first, and then you can use Cal Kestis' action. Or you can use it next turn, but that means you have to take initiative in order for that to happen. And that means that's your first action of the game. These extra actions that you have to take in the early game really slow you down. And for those reasons, I'm going to put him in the C tier. Not horrible. He does deploy early. That's a big advantage. His ability can be decent, but he dies to everything. And it does take a lot of actions to really get some value. Okay. Next up and last of the Cunning leaders, we've got Qui-Gon Jinn. This one's been a fun one, okay? This one has been an extremely fun one. We've got action, use the Force, return a friendly non-leader unit to its owner's hand. You play a non-villainy unit that costs less than the return unit from your hand for free. Then we flip for 6 resources as a 4/7, and we have the same ability, except we don't need to use the Force. It's just when the Qui-Gon Jinn actually completes an attack. Okay, so first off, let's talk about the Force. We talked about it a lot. We talked about it with Cal Kestis. We talked about it with Grand Inquisitor. We talked about it with Barasafi. Qui-Gon is one of the few decks that actually can use the Force a lot better and a lot easier. Of course, your heroism, which means you have a little bit easier time compared to villainy in terms of how many options you have that are actually good options to be playing. But the more important thing is you have access to sneak attack. And this is arguably the most powerful thing you can be doing in the game. So I've seen Qui-Gon Vigilance, I've seen Qui-Gon Command, I've also seen Qui-Gon Double Yellow, and Qui-Gon Aggression. I've seen all 4 combinations. The 2 that have impressed me the most is Double Yellow Qui-Gon and Qui-Gon Vigilance. And the reason that is with Qui-Gon Vigilance, usually people are playing a couple of villainy cards to take benefit out of Anakin. The other thing is that you get to utilize a lot of value pieces from Vigilance and a lot of new Force units to generate the Force really, really quickly, as well as Virgin's Temple. In Double Yellow Command, you get access to Cantina Bouncer and Bodhi Rook, which are exceptionally powerful units to re-trigger the when played effects. So what happens is, because you have sneak attack, you can deploy these cards basically a turn earlier than you otherwise would have been able to. So let's say you're playing Qui-Gon Vigilance. Great. I'm on 6 resources. I'm on 6 resources. I sneak attack out Luke Skywalker. Ooh. Well, he's just going to die anyways. You kill a unit, you get -6/-6. You get an attack him for 6. Sure, you get restore 3. The problem that happens here with sneak attack is, guess what? I snuck out Luke Skywalker. I kill a unit with a trigger. I attack. I maybe kill another unit, or I just attack your base. But then I bounce Luke Skywalker, because guess what? Luke Skywalker attacked, which means if I'm playing the common Force bases, I got the Force again. So now I've bounced Luke Skywalker. Okay, what am I going to do with that Luke Skywalker? Because he is actually a 7-drop. Well, because I have Vigilance in my deck, I'm going to play an Anakin Skywalker now, which is a 5/7. Comes down, gives -3/3 to something else. Maybe kills another thing. And then I can flip Qui-Gon, attack, bounce Anakin, and guess what I can play after that? Plo Koon. It's just really, really powerful on these turns. It can do some of those powerful things in the game. And I'm just talking about Vigilance. As I said, double Cunning is an option. You got like Depa Billaba into Plo Koon. You've got like Qui-Gon unit into Depa Billaba into Plo Koon, which are all 3 ambushers, which means you can immediately get the Force back again because they've ambushed something out. Great. Okay. And even in Command, it's another pretty powerful one too, where you've got like Home Ones or Caloran Becks that you play, you get the trigger, you get a free unit, you bounce it, you play a 6-drop, you can replay Caloran Beck or Home One next turn, and you can just kind of keep up with this cycle. The biggest downside of Qui-Gon is that it's a lot to set up and it's a lot of dirtling sometimes. You're like, do this thing, get this value, do this thing, get this value, but then your opponent just kills you. And that's the biggest downside of Qui-Gon. Despite that, actually, I'm going to put him in the A tier. I think it's behind Snoke. I do think Qui-Gon's actually pretty good so far, and he's gotten a lot of value out, but there is a lot of dirtling that you have to be worried about. And then we move on to the final 2, the heroism and villainy. Okay, single aspect cards. This is where it gets a little bit spicy. All the other leaders here and all the leaders of past evaluations have been an aspect like villainy or heroism, plus another aspect like vigilance, command, aggression, etc. These single aspect leaders, only villainy or only heroism, have a huge downside. And that is you can only play one aspect with it. Now, we did get a few heroism cards and a few villainy cards. I do think in terms of heroism and villainy power, this set, villainy got a lot more. You've got the Darth Malak, you've got the Darth Tyrannus, you've got even like the Kylo Ren, which isn't too bad. In heroism, honestly, there isn't really a whole lot to write home about. And that's something that's a little bit unfortunate with the new cards. If you're looking at heroism, you've got like Luke Skywalker, Jocasta Nu, which again, aren't even cards that I would typically be playing in Anakin decks. Like maybe I'll play a copy of Luke Skywalker, but that's pretty much it. So that is a big upside for villainy. But in terms of power level, we'll start off with Darth Revan here. Only Vigilance. We've got an action, or rather, a passive effect, I should say, that when a friendly unit attacks and defeats a unit, you may exhaust the leader. And if you do, you give an experience token to that friendly unit. Important thing, you have to attack and defeat the unit with that friendly unit. So it's not like you can play an overwhelming barrage and get a ton of value. It's not like you can, kill off a unit and then both units are like it's a 3/3 into a 3/3 and it dies, but you get an experience token so you bring it back. No, they just both die. So a little bit tricky to get the ability to activate. Then he's a 5 to deploy, 3/6. So a little bit below average stats. Restore 1, and then a same ability or same passive effect for Darth Revan on the flip side. I'm honestly disappointed in how they massacred one of my favorite characters. Not that his leader ability is horrible. There are some powerful things you can do, and I'll just talk about that in a moment. But in terms of how valuable his leader ability can be, I can't tell you how many times I've had people just like sit there and like try to keep using his ability, but they could have just killed me instead. And because they were trying to maximize his ability, they lost instead. And then the people who aren't even using his ability because their units are just too weak in that stage of the game, I mean, they just lose, right? His body, 3/6, not great. Restore 1, okay, I guess. Not really sure the Restore 1 and what it's supposed to do in terms of actually functioning with Darth Revan's ability. Maybe it's just a way to stall out the game so you get bigger units. But overall, it's just the ability is just not that strong. There's not enough units that you actually get favorable trades on with just combat damage. And so for those reasons, he's very, very weak in terms of just a leader. You have Darth Revan's lightsabers. You've got like Fallen lightsaber if you want to. There are some cool things you can do. But I'm sorry. I am so sorry, Revan. But he's got to go into C tier. Can I put him behind Cal Kestis? I can't do it. I can't do it. I don't want to put him behind any of these leaders here. I don't think he's like absolutely atrocious because he is a 5 to deploy 3/6, which is honestly better than most of these leaders. Like Kylo Ren comes down too late. Darth Maul comes down too late. Cal Kestis comes down early, but is a pretty poor stat line. I mean, Morgan Elspeth is a 5 resource 3/6, but she doesn't have Restore 1, and her ability does like nothing for the most part. But he only has that one aspect. I can't do it. He's got to go behind the other leaders. I can't. Oh, I'm so biased, guys. It's Revan. It is what it is. He's got to go at the. He's got to go behind. It is what it is. I'm sorry, guys. Revan's got to go like very, very low C tier. He's not like as bad as the D tier leaders, okay? But he's pretty bad. And the single aspect really does punish him. It really does punish him. I think if you could do some really cool things, like let's say Darth Revan was aggression, okay? Would kind of make sense. And then you could play aggression vigilance. Then you can play things like Force Throw and like Always 2. And Always 2 is actually really good in the Darth Revan deck because you have Darth Revan deploy, you deploy Darth Malak, you get to ready him up immediately, and then you can play Always 2, have Darth Revan and Darth Malak get really powerful, and then you could start going to town with like, oh, they got shields and experience tokens, they can just start knocking out units and get them even more powerful every single turn. That can do some cool things. But if you're doing that, you can't play Force Throw or Fifth Brother or all the other manner of good aggression units. So the single aspect really does actually harm because it's not just like, oh, I'm only playing vigilance cards. I'm only playing vigilance cards or I'm only playing aggression cards and I can't play the double aggression cards or double vigilance cards. So for those reasons, the weaker than average body, the kind of mediocre leader ability, the single aspect, it's really pushing Revan a little bit further down. And he's got to end up in the bottom of C tier. I'm sorry, Revan. It is what it is. I can't. Anyways, on to Anakin Skywalker and the final leader of the day. Only heroism. Only heroism. What can we do with Anakin Skywalker? Okay, so we've got an action to use the Force, play a villainy non-unit card from your hand, ignoring its aspect penalties. He deploys for 5 as a 4/6 and has the same action, but instead of having to exhaust your leader on the front side, you can just not exhaust Anakin on the flip side, but you still have to use the Force. So first off, he has to use the Force. How are we going to generate the Force? Virgin's Temple is usually a pretty good sign. And honestly, I haven't even seen Anakin outside of Vigilance, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But honestly, I've only seen Anakin Vigilance. I don't really think the rest of the options out there, like even Anakin Aggression, which I think I might have seen like once, isn't good enough for like Force Throw, because you could still play Force Throw on 3 resources. Remember, it's play a villainy non-unit card. You can't just play any card from your hand, ignoring his aspect penalties as Anakin. So I've seen Vigilance exclusively, and that's mainly because of the new Anakin. It gets really, really powerful with this. So you play Virgin's Temple, you get to play things like Yaddle, you get to play things like potentially R2 or C-3PO. I've also seen just the Force base that, when you attack, you get the Force, which has also worked pretty well. I've played with both. I'm sure I'm going to do a video on one or the other and just try out a bunch. But the key with this is it ignores aspect penalties. Now you might think, oh, I play a villainy card, I could play, things that ignore villainy penalties, right? It's both the aspect, the color aspect, and the identity aspect, which is Vigilance villainy, you ignore, but you also ignore aggression villainy and command villainy and cunning villainy. So in a typical deck, what I'm playing is I'm playing Anakin Vigilance. I've got Power of the Dark Sides in my deck. I've got, potentially the Palpatine's Return in my deck. I've got Overwhelming Barrage in my deck. I've got No Good to Me Deads in my deck. I've got all sorts of villainy, random aspect cards that are exceptionally powerful. And being able to play a Heroism Vigilance deck with Overwhelming Barrage, that's kind of nice. That's pretty nice. And it comes down the same turn that Anakin deploys, which can also be extremely powerful. So yes, there are some really powerful things you can do. However, you are still subject to the single aspect kind of limitation that Darth Revan had. The way you alleviate that, however, is that you do get to ignore those aspect penalties. So yes, you are subject to the same kind of issue that Revan has, but it's not really as impactful. And that's because you get to fill, 9 to 15 slots of your deck with villainy cards that you otherwise would not have been able to play, which means, those cards that would have otherwise been served as a different aspect, you don't feel the pain from those. So you really limit the action of Anakin Skywalker, really helps you limit the downsides of having a single aspect. So I think that's a really good balancing mechanic with Anakin. And as I said, he's a 4/6 when he deploys on 5. So really, really a decent body. Like definitely pretty aggressive and, got a decent amount of toughness. So nothing to complain about there. Really nice Overwhelming Barrage target. Can really snowball games. And then the cherry on top is that you get to pick probably the second best card of the set, or maybe even the best card of the set when you are playing Anakin. And that's because your new Anakin unit, the 6-drop that gives -3/-3 if you have a heroism, and another -3/-3 if you have a villainy card in your discard pile, becomes that double -3/-3 powerhouse that we've been so afraid of. So for all of those reasons, I'm going to put Anakin in A tier. And I think with that, I'm going to drop Barriss down to the top of B tier. And I think that's where we will leave our list. I think, having a lot more leaders in C tier and D tier makes a lot of sense. But yeah, it was a tough way getting here, guys. I think the biggest thing to consider is Obi-Wan, Talzin, and Kanan definitely, and Snoke, to be honest, and Anakin, like all the A and S tier leaders have a good shot at contending. Honestly, like I think there is some powerful things that they do. Kanan, really nice value trades in the early game, really obnoxious as he deploys. Obi-Wan, just overwhelming value as you go through the game. Talzin can really do some nice work as a leader flip to control the board and get you later on in the game. Snoke, just a lot of value as you go along. Anakin, with combining the most powerful events in the game with some of the most powerful units in the game. And Qui-Gon, just a never-ending value train as you get later in the game. These 6, I think, are leaders that I'm really curious to see what people come up with. These are leaders that I'm really curious about. I still think there's some potential with some of the other ones. Like, I think Third Sister could be a very aggressive deck because she doesn't die immediately. I think Ivar, very, very interesting in terms of comes down as this massive body. Can we consistently deploy her? I have not been able to, but maybe the meta will allow it. Barris, are we going to be able to see this really tempo heavy, resource cost reduction, generating the force, getting a ton of value? Are we going to be able to see that? The leaders that I really have a hard time believing that they're going to break in and destroy the meta are the C and D tier ones. Like B tier, there might be something there. A and S tier, I can see someone creating something that's really, really powerful. C and D, I really don't see as great of a path forward. I think the closest one, as I mentioned earlier, was Kylo, because you do have this really cool deploy with a ton of value from your discard pile. So if you're in a super controlling matchup and you're fighting each other out, well, now you get to take advantage of your discard pile and your opponent doesn't. So that's something, I suppose, assuming you've got a couple upgrades in there. I know Kit Fisto was one on the hot takes list, I think. Maybe it's not a hot take. Maybe I'm wrong, and people are just like, yeah, I don't even see how Kit Fisto could be good. But at least that's been my experience. I fought against like 4 or 5 Kit Fistos, regardless of just me playing Kit Fisto myself, over the course of, just like the last week. And we played a ton of games. And every single time, it just was like, okay, you got a Kit Fisto. It's a 2/6. Get an attack, sure. Or it's a 1/6. Can I kill all your other units? It's a 1/6. Great. I think the biggest potential is actually, there's a lot of leaders out there that already exist that got a lot better. I think one of the sneaky ones is Yoda. I fought up against this one individual who's been really crafty with Yoda. I think it's really cool. And I've started to see that deck spread around a little bit. Another leader that obviously people are on the lookout for is Anakin. Anakin getting like things like Yaddle, really powerful. I've seen some experimentation with Count Dooku. Of course, the classics like Quinlan Voss and Kira do get some more units, like Kira Green with ECL. Boom, suddenly you've got Darth Vader. Rey, very interesting. We've seen Double Blue with a lot of the cheap power units. Han 2, you've got like Ogdo Bogdo. You've got a lot of different leaders in the past that I think have some really nice potential in this new set. And obviously those aren't shown here. And to be honest, would I rate any of these leaders like in the S tier right now? In terms of power level, I think Talzin and Obi-Wan, I don't know. I haven't tested enough up against the best decks with a person who's really trying hard. And then for us to min-max Obi-Wan and Talzin, right? I'm just a single person. I don't have enough time to like test all those things. But I do think Obi-Wan is probably like in the A tier category, okay? A tier category. I don't actually think he breaks into the S tier as far as I've seen so far. But again, that could change because the meta could change. And realistically, if you're fighting against a bunch of mid-range decks, it is possible Obi-Wan could enter in the S tier. But that's kind of the beauty of these preemptive lists, right? These are just predictions. They're just kind of how the leaders show up in terms of what the pre-testing was looking like. And that can change drastically because everyone's trying out new cards. We don't know how the new cards are going to affect the new decks or the old decks. And we don't know how the new leaders are going to affect the meta. And that combination is just going to be figured out as everyone gets the set and hundreds, if not, tens of thousands or hundreds, if not, million different people are playing in the open field. So let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Did I snub a leader or did I rate one too highly? Let me know. I am very curious. I think this is one of those leader pools that isn't as controversial as some of the ones we've had in the past. I think set 2 might have been the most controversial, but I am very curious to hear what people have to say. And I'll see you all for the next tier list in a couple of days, I'm sure. See you then.